Hello. On behalf of NAGDA, welcome to today's webinar, The Current State of Public Defined Contribution Plans, Findings from the Public Retirement Research Lab. I hope everyone is well during this difficult time. We are glad that so many of you are interested in this. There are almost 450 of you who are signed up to be here. You can call yourself true data nerds. A few quick things before we begin. We are recording this presentation and will be emailed to all registrants tomorrow. You will be muted for the duration of the webinar. We want you to submit questions throughout the presentation in the Q&A box found in the menu at the bottom of your screen. We also want comments and suggestions. We want it all. Your questions will be monitored by me and by Matt Peterson, NAGDA's Executive Director, and we will relay them to the main speaker as best as we can. Please feel free to send those at any time, and we will get to them, if possible, at the end of the presentation. We are presenting a lot of information to you today, so it may not be possible to get to all of the questions. However, we will record the questions, the chat, all the suggestions, and all the comments. If possible, when you make a comment or a suggestion or have a question, please try to say what page number you are referring to. So if we don't get to it during the presentation, it'll be clearer what the subject is you're interested in. Let me introduce myself. My name is Hank Levy. I am the elected treasurer tax collector of Alameda County, California. The weather here today in Oakland is chilly and raining. I am the main fiduciary and the deferred compensation plan officer for our 457B and 401A defined contribution plans. I am also a trustee for the county's defined benefit pension plan. Joining me today as the main speaker is Jack Vanderhei, Research Director at the Employee Benefit Research Institute, known as EBRI. Welcome, Jack, and thank you for being here. You are hearing us live. No matter how smoothly today goes, I assure you, we have not been pre-recorded. And as in baseball, well, as the way it used to be, mistakes are part of the game. Slide 2. We have a lot of exciting information to cover today. But before we begin, I would like to take a moment to talk about how this came together and who has helped make it possible. The concept for this is pretty simple. Public sector plans are different from private 401k plans. And as public sector plan sponsors, we can only gain insights from our plans by comparing ourselves to other public plans. So about 4 years ago, a group of dedicated NAGDA members, led by the state of Ohio Deferred Comp's Keith Overly, began work to develop a public sector benchmarking survey. The survey was helpful, but as with all surveys, had its limitations. Participation was inconsistent, information was manually entered, the data was inconsistent, there were errors. You can imagine all the problems with this. So a couple of years ago, NAGDA went searching for a better method and found EBRI. The solution was to get the cooperation of a broader group from across the industry, especially with record keepers. 25 years earlier, Jack and his team from EBRI pioneered a method for securely transferring participant-level retirement information from private sector record keepers to a secure, private, and non-individuated database. That database today has grown to encompass over half of the 401k universe. The NAGDA-EBRI partnership, the Public Retirement Research Lab, or PRRL as we affectionately call it, will use those same methods to create a completely distinct public sector database. The research and information you see today will be the first of much more to come from this new database. Today, it incorporates approximately 2.3 million participants, which is approximately 10% of the entire public sector workforce. Not a bad start. Slide 3. As I mentioned, this partnership could not have come together without a selfless and collaborative effort from stakeholders across the public sector. Several companies provided both expertise and financial backing, and I want to recognize them first. This first group we call our founding partners because they really got this thing off the ground. I wish to identify and thank them publicly for their contribution to this effort. They are Capital Group, Invesco, Nationwide. I also want to thank the companies we call our supporting partners. They helped us push the project over the finish line. They are ICMA, RC, Prudential, Voya. Thanks to you very much. In addition, there's two other essential groups of people who have informed the research data and analysis you will see today. The first is the PRRL Research Council, chaired by Ben Taylor from Callan and Wendy Carter from Siegel. You can see the members of their organizations listed here. The second group, which is newer, is the PRRL Plan Sponsor Advisory Council. For those of you familiar with NAGDA, you know the plan sponsor perspective is at the core of everything we do. Keith Overly is the chair of the council. I am the vice chair. Thank you so much, Keith. And thank you to all the members who are listed here. Our mission is to provide the plan sponsor perspective and to ensure that everything that comes out of the PRRL helps inform the decision-making of plan sponsors. Slide 6, go. Before we get into the presentation, I want to address three specific privacy concerns that have been expressed by some. First, the research is based on participant level data, but this data is not accessible to anyone but EBRI. EBRI is a trusted source and has been accessing private sector participant level data for 25 years. The PRRL will allow industry members and academic institutions to request custom reports from the participant database, but no participant level data will ever be made public. And in fact, the PRRL Research Council has decided that 5 plans should be the minimum number of plans that will be included in any analysis. Again, there will be no access to data on an individual level, none. 2, the purpose of this endeavor is plan level benchmarking. The survey won't allow access to any other specific plan to a plan sponsor other than your own. If you are a plan sponsor, you will be able to access your own information. This will happen through the data portal. Instructions are currently on NAGA's website on how to use the data portal, but the data we are presenting today has not yet been loaded into it. So this will happen. In the near future, we will put on a webinar to explain how to use the portal. Third, the Research Council also decided that the information will not be broken down by record keepers. We need the cooperation of all the record keepers, and it is important that it is never used to compare one to another. If you are a plan sponsor and want to participate in the PRRL and have not yet done so, we want you. You can sign up at the link in the chat box. When you sign up, the PRRL will work with your record keeper to transfer your participant level data to EBRI. As a plan sponsor myself, the part I'm looking forward to the most is to access my plan data through the benchmarking tool. And for all of us plan sponsors, the data is free. Because we signed up last year, we have our 2019 data in PRRL. If you are a plan sponsor and sign up for the PRRL today, your data won't start until 2020. Finally, all benchmarking tools attempt to compare what we call you to the universe, and the PRRL is no exception. We want to help plan sponsors use this data to compare themselves to the data presented in the PRRL. Okay, Jack, enough of me talking. Let's get to the fun part of today's presentation. Jack's accomplishments go back at least 45 years, perhaps more. He won't admit it. Researcher, teacher, congressional testifier, professor, PhD from the Wharton School. But the only thing he wanted me to say about him was, he is from Wisconsin. Jack, you have been working through the data of over 2.3 million public sector DC plan participants. What will we be covering today? What have you found?
Okay, well, thank you very much, Hank. And before I get started, I want to express my gratitude to both Matt Peterson from NAGDA and Lori Lucas from EBRI for being the driving forces behind much of this. and certainly thank the record keepers for their continued participation, because without them, none of this would be possible. Let me make two real quick comments before we start going through the findings, if you don't mind. First, this is part of a broader research agenda on public sector employees that we're going to be doing with PRRL. As Hank mentioned, today we're going to talk about the state of public defined contribution plans. That's going to be followed up hopefully fairly quickly by a more complete picture of public sector retirement savings, where we're going to combine the PRRL data from today with 401k and IRA data to have a more complete portfolio for many of these employees. Then we're going to move on to look at defined benefit plans as a source of income for public sector defined contribution participants. And then sometime probably in the fourth quarter of 2021, we're going to wrap all of this together and come up with a model to estimate the retirement savings for public sector employees. We can look at basically whether there's gaps, if there are, how they can best be filled, et cetera. So this is, as I say, part of basically 4 different analyses we're going to be looking at during the course of the year. But we had to start someplace, and obviously the most important part was with the public DC plans. The second point I want to make before we move on is I'm going to be doing a lot of comparisons with private 401k plans throughout the presentation. As Hank mentioned, in conjunction with the Investment Company Institute, we've been analyzing 401k behavior with administrative data from record keepers since 1996. The last publication we had was based on 27 million participants from 110,000 different plans. But there's one really important difference between what I've been doing with ICI on the private 401k side and what we're going to be doing on the public DC side, is that we actually know the identity of the plan sponsor in PRRL, unlike what we do with EBRI ICI. And why that is so important, it's going to allow us to use plan specific data to do additional analysis. For example, the impact of auto enrollment, auto escalation, et cetera. Those are things that we basically need to have plan specific information to do a better job on the analysis. And also, it's going to appear that a significant amount of previous analysis by think tanks and other people in this field on defined contribution plans for public employees, just probably because there was no other data available, ended up assuming that the public employees look like 401k participants. We've already had one PRRL study that looked at the basic differences between tenure in the public and the private sector. And we're going to emphasize a lot of the differences that we're seeing on the DC side between public and private employees today. So as you're going to see, that's probably not the case. And one of the big reasons why we wanted to go ahead and put this kind of data together. So if we can move to slide 8, please. As far as the year-end 2019 PRRL data, and again, as Hank mentioned, we are in the process of collecting the year-end 2020 data now. We did have 2.3 million participants, as Hank mentioned. We had almost $114 billion in assets, and we had 213 plans. But just a quick note on the number of plans and governments. Well, let me just do the pie chart first. If you take a look at the 116 governments that sent us the 213 plans, about half of them were city, 17% state, 18% county, and 19% subdivision. But a quick note on that, as I'm sure many of you are aware, many of the participating state plans are the primary DC plan for hundreds, or in some cases even thousands of smaller governments. So that even though we have 116 different governments contributing in 2019, the participants in this database will represent a far wider swath of public employees than just the couple hundred of governments represented here. One of the other things I just want to mention is, obviously, this is year 1. We have a statistically credible amount of information, but obviously We're hoping that in future years, we're going to be able to add to that size considerably, and that'll make it much easier to extrapolate to the entire public defined contribution universe. And we'll talk more about that on the very last slide. Slide 9, please. So in terms of distribution of what we're looking at today by plan type, if you look at participants, almost exactly half of them are coming from 457B plans, and these are primary plan types. We'll talk about the difference in just a couple of minutes. We have about a quarter in 401A plans, 22% in 401K plans, and kind of a de minimis number of both 403B and IRA. We won't spend a lot of time on either of those, at least in 2019, although again, we do hope to be able to be in a situation where we can add substantially to the 403B universe going forward. When we take a look at the right-hand side as far as assets, we see that even though the 457B had almost exactly half the participants, they have a larger percentage of the total assets. And the reason that is the 457B overall average account balances of $58,000 are larger than the overall average for the entire universe of 51,000. So that's basically why you see a larger number on the right side than on the left side. Moreover, when you look at the difference between 401Ks and 401As on the left side versus the right side, basically the difference here is because the 401K average balance is coming in at 63,000, whereas the 401A balance is only coming in at 25,000. So that explains, although they're just about equal with regard to participants, that when it comes to looking at weights for assets, you have a much larger percentage of 401K plans than 401A. So if we can move to slide 10. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on slide 10. Oftentimes people are extremely interested, especially when you start looking at plan types, as to how much they differ from one type to another. Again, there's nothing really earth-shattering in this particular picture other than the 401K plan participants, the ones right in the middle, tend to be much younger than, tend to be much older. Got that wrong. Tend to be much older than the other plan participants. You see only 7.6% of the 401K participants are in their 20s, which is much, much smaller than the other plans. If we can move to slide 11. So we're going to start 4 different segments of analysis. We're going to start out with account balances. We're also going to look at contributions. Then we're going to look at plan loans, and we're going to end it up with asset allocations. So if we can move to slide 12, please. I'm going to start with the mean and median account balances by age for all plan types. Now, personally, we show these graphs not necessarily because I think they're the most useful way of showing this, but without a doubt, the most common question we get is, what is the average account balance by age? And I really hate to break it out this way, because for any one of these 10-year age cohorts, you have some individuals who may have just been with one employer their entire career, while others may have changed jobs and only had a few years to accumulate. And we'll get to the next slide in a couple seconds and show you the average balances by both age and tenure. But as long as we're here, let me emphasize 2 points. First, on the left-hand side, the mean balances for each 10-year cohort are considerably larger than the medians. And again, just a quick statistical footnote for those of you that might have either slept through your statistics course or had it so long ago, it's kind of a fuzzy memory. When we come up with the means, we basically just add all the account balances in a particular age cohort together and divide it by the number of participants. Whereas with the median, we basically rank order all of them and pick the one in the middle. So if we had, for example, 1,000 participants in their 20s and rank ordered them, then we'd in essence approximately pick the 500th person out of 1,000, and whatever that balance is, that's what we have for the median. Now, what you obviously have here in the situation that we're looking at right now is a distribution that, as they refer to in statistics, is quite skewed, because you see that the averages, the means, excuse me, are much bigger or have much longer tails than do the medians. So for example, if you start in the means for people in their 20s, you have an average of about 4,000 that increases to about 96,000 by the time you get to the 60s. Whereas for the medians, they're always going to be much less than that. Starts out at $1,100 and grows to about $31,000. Now, this is partially due to the correlation between age and tenure as far as that overall increase. As you get older, you have higher balances, and we're going to look at that on the next slide in a second and try and unwind some of that. But before I do, one of the really, really important parts that I want to stress is that many other analyses may have looked at only single plans, but what we're doing is we're combining every public DC plan that an individual has, either with that record keeper or across the universe we're looking at. How much of a difference that makes really depends on which kind of plan type you're looking at. So if we can look at the right-hand side for just a couple of seconds, what I have here is the percent of participants with multiple plans by primary plan type. So what this means is for anyone who has a 401A plan, 30% of them also have another plan. It could be another 401A, a 457B, a 401K, or a 403B. But it makes it very clear that if you look only at the primary plan, you're probably missing a great deal when it comes to certainly the account balances. 457B, you have about 16% of those that have a secondary plan. 401K, about 1/5, 21.8%. And 403B, again, we have a very, very small sample size for 403B, so I wouldn't necessarily assume that that number will stay the same as the sample grows. But right now, that's not that much of a problem. Only 1.4% of our 403B participants actually have a secondary plan. So if we could move on to slide 13, please. Looking here at average account balance by age and tenure. So this is based on exactly the same information we saw on the previous slide as far as the means are concerned. But for each tenure cohort, we're able to break it down by tenure with the current employer. So for example, if you look at the right-hand column of this particular slide in the grid on the bottom, you'll see that on the previous slide, we had an overall average or mean for people in their 60s of $96,000. You see, though, that for that same group of people, if you break it out by how many years they're with the current employer, that goes all the way from only $25,000 for people who are relatively new at that current employer, 0 to 2 years, all the way down to the bottom of that right-hand column, those people who have been with the same employer for at least 30 years, and that gets you up to $155,000, actually close to $156,000. Now, of course, there's many other variables that are going to be important in explaining what somebody's account balance is. And we don't have time to go through them all today, but there's going to be a forthcoming PRRRL publication that will go through many additional variables. So we'll be able to look at, for example, the influence of salary on account balances, et cetera. Slide 14, please. So what this is showing is the same kind of template, the same format, people in tenure age cohorts broken down by the same overall tenure categories, but this is looking at private 401k plans. This is the database that Sarah Holden from ICI and I have been looking at now for many, many years. This is the most recent one available in 2016. We're right now updating, and we'll have one coming out for 2018, hopefully in February. But I just wanted to give you some comparison as far as what happens if you assume, in essence, 401k account balances are a good proxy for public defined contribution balances. Now, before we even look at the numbers, there's a very important reason why you wouldn't necessarily expect average defined contribution balances in the public sector to be as large as they are in the private sector. And that, of course, comes down to defined benefit plans. The last BLS numbers available show that about 86% of public employees are in a defined benefit plan, whereas only about 15% of private employees are in a defined benefit plan. So all else equal, given the fact that so few of the private employees are now participating in defined benefit plans, you would expect that the defined contribution balances for private employees would be larger than public, excuse me. And that's basically what we see. I'm not going to go through each one of these cells, but again, if you just want to go to the bottom right-hand corner, you see that you have here a balance of about 288,000 for people on the verge of retirement in the 60s who have been with that same employer for 30 years or more. And that 288,000 again compares to that same figure on the previous slide of $156,000. Now, again, this is from 2016, the current chart, and obviously some of these balances would be expected to be increased. And as I said, hopefully within a couple of weeks now, we'll have the new updated data for EBRI-ICI to compare to this. So slide 15, please. Now what I want to start doing is in the next 4 slides, show that same average account balance by age and tenure, but this time break it out into plan type. And these are going to be the primary plan types we have for each employee. I want to make one quick technical note. These are not the same tenure breaks as I had on the EBRI-ICI graph, nor the original PRRRL graph. The reason I've recombined them is to make sure that we have confidentiality among all the record keepers. So the one thing, if you could just keep in mind that when we look at this by tenure quartiles, I won't have specific numbers in the axis for you, but basically the way we break it up is the lowest tenure quartile in these graphs are going to be people with less than 3 years with the current employer. The second quartile will be those with 3 to 7 years. The third quartile will be 7 to 17 years. And the highest quartile will be those people with more than 17 years with the current employer. So just keep in mind, whereas we were focusing before on those employees that have been with one employer for at least 30 years, this highest quartile is going to still have them, but they're also going to have a number of individuals with lower tenure, so you're not going to expect to have the same kind of high balances that you had seen in the lower right-hand corner before. I'm going to go through 4 different plans. I'm going to start with the plan with the largest percentage of assets in our sample, and that's the 457B plans. And then basically, I'm going to just quickly focus on the bottom right-hand corner of the grid. And so we see that for this situation, people on the verge of retirement in their 60s who have the highest are in the highest quartile of tenure, meaning 17 years, more than 17 years with the same employer. We come up with a balance of almost $170,000. So if you would like to move on to slide 16, again, the template is going to be exactly the same for all 4 plan types. I'm going to now move to the plan type with the second highest amount of assets in our sample, that's 401k plans. And again, just focusing on a single number at the bottom right-hand corner, you see that for people in their 60s that have been with a current employer for more than 17 years, we have an average account balance of 100 grand. Moving on to slide 17, we're moving to the next plan type, the 401A. You find, again, if you want to look at the bottom right-hand corner, a number very, very similar to the 401k plans. So if you basically take the same age cohort with the same number of years of tenure with the employer, you're coming up with an average balance of almost exactly the same. In this case, it's 97,000. And then finally, if we could move to slide 18, please. Here's the 403B plans. And again, huge caveat. It's a really small sample size right now, so I wouldn't necessarily read a lot into the 403B plan analysis, but you do see, again, looking at the bottom right-hand corner, that the overall average for the 403B plans is smaller for those people in their 60s with the highest tenure quartile than they were for the other three plan types. So if we could move to, thank you, the contribution slide.
Jack,
Yes,
Jack,
sorry.
can I break in for a minute? Somebody asked whether we know whether there has been rollovers from prior employers into it. I don't think we know that, do we? We don't know that.
We do not have the flag for that, but I'm able to, in many cases, go back and control based on tenure and based on contributions coming in to identify those and put basically a proxy for those flags on. We don't have separate information from all the record keepers on that yet. That's something we might be able to get in 2020, but I can break those out as separate numbers if that's what people would like.
Great, thanks.
Sure. So slide 19, we're going to now go from the account balance section to the contribution section. And starting with slide 20, next slide 20, thank you. Look at the mean and median employee contributions by age. Please pay particular attention to the note on the bottom, because I'm only going to look at individuals who made a contribution in 2019. We can go back and look at this other ways if you would like, but this is what we're going to be focusing on for the next couple of slides in this particular section. Again, I've broken it out for you by mean and by median, and I think very few people would be surprised that as one gets older, we see in dollar terms higher average and higher median account balances across all age groups. So you see that for the means, we're going from a mean of 1,100 in the 20s up to almost $4,000 for those in the 60s. So if we could go to the slide 21, what we're doing now is, and again, I have to be very clear on the note on the bottom, we're not going to be looking at participants who did not make a contribution in 2019. And I'm also excluding anybody whose salary is less than $10,000. Now, we can put those people back in if anyone has a particular desire to see them. I'm basing this basically on the fact that oftentimes it's very difficult to figure out for people who have very low salaries if they've actually been in the plan for the full year. Maybe they came in late in the year, maybe they left early in the year. And we did a lot of analysis with the EBRI-ICI data over the years, and we basically came up with a default of a $10,000 threshold to be included in this analysis. That could be changed if you'd like to see others, but just so you know, that's what's happening in this one. I don't think, again, that this will be very surprising to people, except for the fact that the mean and the median contribution rate actually goes down from the 20s to the 30s. And in essence, there's a lot of other things going on here. It's the composition of plan types, as well as some plan specific information such as auto enrollment, auto escalation, that we'll be looking at in much more detail when we get into the actual publication. But what we see here is a situation where you have a relatively constant overall contribution rate. Now, there's not comparable contribution numbers from the EBRI-ICI universe for 2019 to compare this to, but Vanguard did recently come up with a publication where they have their 2019 estimate for overall average, and they found across all age groups in their private 401k plan universe of 7.0% for a mean. So our overall average, if you basically go across all age cohorts, comes out to 6.2%. So at least in this particular set of the universe, we see that the public defined contribution rates are slightly lower, at least than the Vanguard universe, when you basically average across all age cohorts. So if we could move on to slide 22. The only difference between this and the slide 2 slides ago was that one only looked at employee contributions, whereas this is looking at both employee and employer contributions. For example, you can see that if you go all the way over to the right-hand side in the 60s, you now have a $4,200 average contribution combined employee and employer, whereas 2 slides ago, that same number was $3,900. So basically you have approximately a $300 average for the employer contributions when you look at that as a separate element, which we didn't have time to go through today. The medians also increased. If you look at people in their 60s, you had about $1,300 if you looked only at the employees, and now you're up to $1,453 if you're looking at employees and employers. Okay, so if we could go to the next one, slide 23, here's the same situation where we're looking at total contributions. So this will be both employee and employer, but we're now, again, looking only at participants who made a contribution in 2019. If they didn't, they're excluded. And once again, because we need salary to come up with the rate, we're excluding anybody whose salary is less than $10,000. Again, perhaps not surprisingly, what we had seen 2 slides ago, since the overall averages for people in their 20s were higher than people in their 30s, we see the same kind of thing going on with the contribution rates when we add employee and employer contribution rates together. So slide 24. Now we're going to go through loan activity for a couple of minutes. And slide 25 shows you the percent of participants with a loan outstanding by age. And if you compare these to similar figures that we had with EBRI ICI for 2016, we're actually showing the incidence of plan loans to be much smaller for PRRL than we did with the corporate 401k universe. So very quickly, taking this age by age, we only see 1.1% for people in their 20s, whereas with EBRI ICI, it came out at 8%. 30s, we see 4.1, EBRI ICI came at 20%. 40s, we're seeing 7.3, whereas with the corporate 401ks, we had 25%. 50s, 6.3% for us, 23% for the corporate 401ks. And in the 60s, we're seeing only 3%, whereas for the corporate 401ks and EBRI ICI, we were coming up with 14%. So if you go to slide 26, what we're now trying to focus on is just for those people with loans. So we're excluding all the zeros. What's the average amount of loan by age? And you see something that increases rather substantially from $1,600 for people in their 20s all the way to almost $8,500 for people in their 60s. We don't have age breakouts for EBRI ICI, but what we do have is an overall number for 2016 of $7,900. So basically, we're in a situation, all this together, we have a much smaller average amount of loan for the PRRL universe than we did for the corporate 401k universe. And then slide 27 shows the average loans as a percentage of account balance by age. So again, we're excluding anybody with a loan. We're taking their loan balance, we're dividing it by their account balance. And in this case, we get something that is somewhat ambiguous vis-a-vis what we came up with for EBRI-ICI. In fact, for PRRL, we're coming up with numbers that are much smaller for younger workers, but larger for older workers. So for example, for people in their 20s, PRRL's coming up with 10.9%. So again, that's saying for those that took out a loan, on average in their 20s, they've got about 10% of their account balance taken out as a loan. Whereas for EBRI-ICI in their 20s, we came out with 23%. For people in their 30s, we're coming up with 14.8. For EBRI-ICI, we came up with 17. People in their 40s, we have 16%. EBRI-ICI was 12%. In their 50s, we're now up to 16.6%, whereas for corporate 401ks and EBRI-ICI, we only had 9%. And then finally, you see we're all the way up to 19% for PRRL for people in their 60s, whereas for the corporate universe, that was only 7%. Okay, so if we could move on to slide 28, I'm going to now set up the last section.
I just want to interrupt one thing. That amazing difference between the private sector and the public sector regarding loans. We're getting a lot of questions in the chat about that, which I won't ask you, but that's got to be one of the biggest differences beside account balances. That's got to be one of the biggest differences that this research has shown so far. It's amazing.
Okay. Well, we can certainly, I'm assuming we're out of time for Q&A. If there's additional runs people would like to see based on the participant loan information, again, feel free to send them to me at vanderhei@ebri.org. The database is all set up. I could run that for you almost immediately, but we'll handle that in Q&A if that's okay. So then the last section we're on is the asset allocation. And before I show you anything, just keep in mind there's two ways to do asset allocation. There's participant weighted and there's asset weighted. We're going to show both of those in the publication, but for purposes of what we're showing today, it appeared most people were primarily interested in the asset weighted allocation. So somebody with $100,000 account balance will basically count 10 times as much as somebody with only a $10,000 account balance. Again, if you want to see the others, we have those and can certainly make them available. I have one other extremely important thing to mention. The actual investment for each of these 2.3 million participants has now been hand-coded, and we have several dozen different asset allocation categories that we're going to be using in the full analysis. In fact, that's going to be the subject of the next PRRL webinar on March 17th that we're going to talk about when we get to the last slide. But for today, I wanted to compare them to the private 401k universe. And so I grouped them together into categories similar to what we've been using for EBRI-ICI since the mid-90s. So we have much more detail, but just to do the initial comparisons, I've collapsed them into a relatively small number of categories. So if we could go on to the next slide, please. Okay, so here's the asset weighted allocations by age for PRRL. And you see a couple of things that may be surprising, perhaps not. Equities, for example, increase substantially, but peak when you get into your 40s. Target dates are very high in their 20s, 63%, and then decrease rapidly until they're only 13% in their 60s. Money and stable value, those are separate categories in EBRI-ICI, by the way. I combined them for purposes of what we're doing here in PRRL. Increases rather substantially from 5.6% in the 20s to basically 29% in their 60s. And bonds also have an increase, although certainly not as substantial, and they go from 2% in their 20s to 8.4% in their 60s. Okay, so we've laid out what PRRL looks like in 2019. Now the next slide, slide 30, if we could go to that, shows the same categories, but this time we're looking at the private 401k plans, again, from the most recent EBRI-ICI, which is 2016. So the one thing that I think is going to be extremely interesting to many people is, even though the absolute values of the numbers of the percentages differ, you see exactly the same age profiles for the first four categories. So for example, you look at equities, just like with the PRRL universe, on the private 401k universe, equities peak in the 40s. Both bond and money stable value increase with age, and TDFs have a significantly larger value in their 20s than in their 60s. Now, the numbers aren't going to necessarily match up from the 401k to the PRRL universe. There's a lot of reasons. One, if you look at the column next to the end, when you've got 401k plans, you've obviously got company stock still floating around, sometimes in relatively large numbers. For some of these plans, that's not going to be a component of the asset allocations we're looking at, obviously, in PRRL. So if we could go to the next slide, please. There's probably not a lot here that you hadn't already seen 2 slides ago when I gave you the PRRL asset weighted allocations by age. But because the correlation between age and tenure is not perfect, it's desirable to look at those same categories to see if those with the lowest tenure had substantially different asset allocations. And for a lot of the work Sarah Holden and I have done with EBRI-ICI, that's particularly true for TDFs in the private 401k plans, given automatic enrollment in QDIAs, basically after PPA. What we see here, if you want to take a look at the TDFs, is that those with the shortest tenure had a higher allocation in TDFs, but the primary drop seems to happen after about 10 years. So you see you go from about 36% for those people with 5 to 10 years tenure in the target date, drops all the way down to only 18% for individuals with 10 to 20 years. So if we could move on to the next slide, please. Now what I'm going to be doing is going through 4 different slides looking at the 4 major categories of assets we've just explored. The first one's going to look at equity by age and by plan type. So again, 403Bs are on here just to give you a complete picture, but 403Bs have a very, very small sample size. So again, I wouldn't necessarily read a whole lot into these, but what you can see obviously from the way we break this out for equities is that the 401As have a much lower equity allocation than do either the 401Ks or the 457s. If you go to slide 33, you see for bonds that 401A and 457 have a much lower bond allocation than 401K plans. If you go to slide 34, we're looking now at money and stable value together. You see that basically after age 30, I'm still having a hard time explaining what's going on in the 20s, but after age 30, the 401As have a much larger allocation to money and stable value than do either the 401K or 457s. And then finally on slide 35, we're now looking at target date funds, and we see that the 401A has the largest allocation to target date funds of the different plan types, especially at the youngest ages. That's followed by the 457Bs, and then basically the 401Ks And just, I would say, just ignore the 403B numbers for now. So with that, if we could go to the next slide, Carly. Next steps, as I mentioned, and I think there'll be a way of signing up for this relatively soon. The next PRRL webinar is going to be on asset allocation and is going to have much more granular categories than the 8 different categories we looked at here. We're also going to be breaking it out basically on conditional availability. So individuals who do not necessarily have a particular asset allocation available to them in their portfolio will not necessarily be included. We hopefully will get into a lot of information showing how, given different types of choices, how that's going to influence how employees pick some of these different asset allocations. And the one thing that I'm really looking forward to, this will not be March 17th, but when we start getting the 2020 information in, as the portfolios available to the plan participants start to change. So for example, option A is taken out and option B is added. How is that going to impact how people are necessarily reallocating their assets across the overall choices? The other thing that I'll be spending a lot of time on in the next couple of weeks is doing much more breakout than you saw here today. We just didn't have time to go through it all. We want to do breakouts with additional plan level detail. We're certainly going to break it out by type of government. We're going to break it out to the extent possible as to whether or not people have defined benefit plans. Eventually, that will also at least include a proxy for the generosity of the defined benefit plan. By the time we get to the 4th set of research that I talked about very early on, where we're going to do overall retirement income adequacy for public sector employees, we'll have both the defined contribution balances projected out to retirement age, as well as the defined benefit accruals, so we can put all that together. And certainly to the extent that we have public sector employees that are not participating in Social Security, that is definitely going to be something that we're going to be used to break out this analysis going forward. So I think the next slide goes back to Hank, if I remember.
Thanks, Jack.
Okay.
I just want to say something about the asset allocation part. There's so much more to say. And again, as Jack said, we're going to be having our next webinar. It's on the screen at 2 o'clock Eastern time on March 17th. This is a subject that Alameda County's been struggling with. And I mean, even your data about how people move out of target date funds, I never even thought about. So it even gives me a chance to kind of go back to, my own data. My record keeper has pretty good data itself. It doesn't benchmark it against the public data, which is what the PRRL will do. So it's given me sort of really interesting ideas about what I can do to think about and how it compares to everybody else. Jack, we had a couple of sort of larger questions, and you've touched on some. And I think, the big elephant in the room is the difference between participation in defined benefit plans, and you talked about that. What about a simple question? Well, I don't know if it's simple. How many plans have employer contributions? You made some slides that had both employer and employee, but actually, how many of them, and how does that compare to the private sector? I have some assumptions, but you know better than I do.
Well, it's definitely a function of plan type. And I do have those slides. I mean, I do have that analysis. I'm sorry I didn't make slides on that. That's something I can put together for you almost immediately, but you definitely have major differences across plan types as far as what percentage of participants, this is of participants who made a contribution in 2019, what percentage of them also had employer contributions. It could be a match, it could be some other kind of employer contribution, but we have all that data, but I just apologize, Hank, it's not in front of me right now, but I would need to break it out by plan type anyways, but we can get that out however you want to get that out very quickly.
Yep. Yeah, I want to tell people, if we don't get to your questions today, we're going to go through as many as we can. You can reach out to your record keeper. You can reach out to the plan sponsor committee. You can reach out to Jack directly. He's up until all hours fielding your questions. There's lots of different ways. You can reach out to NAGDA. So there's a lot of different ways for you to ask your questions to us. All right, let me see. Do we have any other kind of questions? Jack, you have any other final thoughts?
Well, again, I can't begin to express my gratitude sufficiently to the record keepers. I mean, without them, none of this works. As well as the plan sponsors, without their permission, none of this works. I'm basically trying to give as much value added as possible to both the plan sponsors and the record keepers for participating in this. You had mentioned the U versus universe analysis. When people do get that information, if there are other types of things they'd like to see that are not included, please let me know. We do something similar with EBRI ICI that we've been, as I say, been doing since the mid-90s. We want to make this as useful to the plan sponsors and the record keepers as possible. We want to make sure that once you're in the database, you'll never, ever, ever want to leave. So anything you want to see as a result of this, just please let me know. I'd be more than happy to provide. The one thing, again, confidentiality, we have to make sure that we're not comparing you to, in essence, somebody that can be unmasked, whose experience can be unmasked, even though you don't know who they are. So there might be some ways you'd like to see your data cut that unfortunately I can't find enough other plans to compare you to. So I would come back and let you know that. But don't feel shy about asking. I mean, that's what we're trying to do. And hopefully next year, this will be much more of a, I won't say painless, but more of an automatic pilot type of endeavor to get these things going. And if there's any new record keepers, any new plan sponsors that have that are looking for information, for example, on plan security, I have more than enough to provide to whether you want to talk about it with me directly or you would like to basically forward it to individuals in your organization who have to make the decision on this. Please let us know. But basically, this is something, as I say, we've been doing on the corporate 401k side now since the mid 90s, and I really look forward to trying to expand that as much as possible to the public DC side. Thank you.
And I'd like to make a plea to anybody in the audience too, as time goes on, is to, if you have any stories about how data has helped you actually make decisions or start programs that have been successful, if any of this data has helped with, aspects of your financial wellness programs, financial security programs, please let us know. Well, I think we're winding up. We're getting up to 2 minutes. 2 minutes. Matt, are there any more questions that have come through that we'd like to ask Jack before we let him go? Jack, I think you're enjoying this new data. I think you've been tired of that old private sector data. So we're going to give you a chance, to do it again.
I look forward to the opportunity, Hank, and again, thank you to the NAGDA committees. You've been extraordinarily helpful in getting through this. We did put this thing together very quickly compared to what we did on the 401k side. So again, none of this would have been possible had it not been for many different individuals helping out and organizations. So thank you again.
Yes, and I just want to remind everybody, the webinar will be recorded, will be accessible. You'll receive it via email tomorrow. So I think we're just about at the top of the hour, perfect timing. Thank you, everybody. Please get involved, reach out to any number of us. Thanks very much. Have a good day. And in this difficult time, please stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you, Hank.